Hello and welcome to Fresh Catholic Courses. This is Series 6. This is Episode 3 of Series 6, and our topic under consideration, the virtues. I'm Charles Merritt. Thank you for tuning in, as we say. Little quick review. Episode 1, we went up to 30,000 feet, and we looked at the virtues in general and learned what they do overall. And then we learned that there were two categories of them, theological and moral. The theological virtues, you've got faith, hope, and love, or charity. The moral virtues, you've got fortitude, prudence, temperance, and justice. And then last episode, we started looking through each of these virtues in particular, and we're going to continue that process today. Last episode, we looked at the first of the theological virtues, faith. Today we'll look at the second and the third of the theological virtues, those being hope and love. And if you recall last episode, I indicated that for these three theological virtues, I kind of start our discussion of them the same way, and that is by distinguishing the natural version of it versus the theological or the supernatural version. So last episode we talked about the distinction between natural faith and supernatural faith. We'll start our discussion of hope and love the same way. We'll look at natural hope versus supernatural hope, and then we'll take a look at natural love versus supernatural love, because as we saw when we did this for faith, there is a definite difference. There is a distinction. So once again, our job this episode, theological virtues 2 and 3, hope and love, and we'll do them in that order. So as far as hope goes, okay, first of all, distinction between natural and supernatural. Now, natural hope, how can we define it? Well, natural hope is the confident desire of obtaining some future good that is either difficult or uncertain. Let me go ahead and repeat that. Natural hope is the confident desire of obtaining some future good that is either difficult or uncertain. So let me just parse out a couple of terms in that definition. Difficult in that it's hard to obtain. Uncertain because it's not totally under our control. Future because we don't have it yet. And good in that we perceive it'll be of some benefit to us. So that's the natural definition, or that's the definition of natural hope. The confident desire of obtaining some future good that's either difficult or uncertain. Now, how does that differ from supernatural hope? Or I should say, how does supernatural hope differ from that? Well, let's define supernatural hope. Supernatural hope is we desire God and God's kingdom as our ultimate happiness. And we do that by placing our trust in God, in His promises, and in His grace, and not in our own strength. So again, let me repeat that definition. Supernatural hope, we desire God and God's kingdom as our ultimate happiness, and we do that by placing our trust in God Himself, His promises, His grace, and not on our own strength. That's supernatural hope. Now, what does that enable us to do? It enables us to do several things, and I've gone ahead and listed 4 of them for us. Number 1, having that supernatural hope, having that confident expectation in God and His grace and His promises, it keeps us from being discouraged in our pursuit of holiness, in leading a moral and virtuous life. It helps us persevere, within difficulties. It helps sustain us when we feel that we're being abandoned by God, when we don't really feel His presence and we don't think He's with us. And it enables us to remain joyful in the midst of trials and tribulations. Now, when we say joyful, that doesn't necessarily mean we'll always necessarily be happy or giddy during these trials and tribulations, but we'll be joyful knowing that there's an ultimate purpose for that. And if we use these trials and tribulations, if we endure them and go through them rightly, they can help us in our redemption, and we can offer them up for the redemption of other people. So supernatural hope really, in terms of, persevering, bearing up, sustaining when things get difficult during trials and tribulations, what enables us to do that and be joyful in the midst of doing that? Supernatural hope, the confident expectation that our desire of God and His kingdom doesn't rest on our own strength. It rests on God, His graces, and His promises. Now, interestingly enough, St. Paul talks a lot about remaining joyful under difficulties and trials and tribulations. He talks a lot about this virtue of hope. Let me give you two passages. Romans 12, chapter 12, verse 12. Rejoice in your hope. Be patient in tribulation. And then again, we see in the Apostle James, chapter 1, verses 3 and 4. Let me read you what he has to say. I count it as all joy when you fall into trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience. But let patience have its perfect work, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. I count it as all joy when I fall into trials. What enables him to say that? The supernatural virtue of hope. Let's go one more passage. 1 Peter chapter 3:15, where he says, be ready to give a reason, to give an answer for the hope that is within you. So whether you're talking about St. Paul in Romans, whether you're talking about James, whether you're talking about Peter in 1 Peter, they all center on this virtue of hope, enabling us to be joyful and to endure and bear up with trials, tribulations, and difficulties, knowing that ultimately there's a purpose to them and that we can place our trust in God, that there is a purpose, and that if we can endure them and bear up under them and be joyful, that will enable us to pursue holiness and lead a moral and virtuous life, and hopefully obtain our ultimate happiness, which is heaven. So that's what supernatural hope is, and that's what enables us to do. And if you think about it, bearing up, persevering, trials, tribulations, difficulties, persecutions, etc., etc., that's our lot as disciples of Christ. That's that's what we signed up for. That comes with the territory. We're gonna have to go through trials and tribulations and persecutions and difficulties, and we're going to have to endure them and bear up under them, and not only endure them and bear up under them, but do it well. And so since that's what we signed up for, since that's the nature of the beast, so to speak, since that comes with the territory, since that's our lot as disciples of Christ, in order to do that, this supernatural virtue of hope plays right into that. That's what enables us to do what we signed up for, what the nature of the beast is, so to speak. So just like we said yesterday, supernatural virtue of faith, critical to the spiritual life, our pursuit of holiness. Same thing with the supernatural virtue of hope, critical in the spiritual life and our pursuit of holiness, especially the part of enduring and persevering under trials, tribulations, and difficulties, and not just white knuckling it, not just gritting our teeth, but doing it with joy, knowing that if we can do that, that's a big step forward to our ultimate happiness, which is heaven. So that's the first couple of things we can say. Let's distinguish between natural and supernatural hope, which we've done, and then talk a little bit about what supernatural hope enables us to do. Now, how does it enable us to do that? Well, yesterday we said faith elevates the intellect. Hope, well, we said faith perfects the intellect in that it elevates the intellect. Hope perfects the will in that it elevates the will. Now, this is kind of interesting because we know that we're made in the image and likeness of God, and what that means is we have an intellect and a will. And these first two virtues direct themselves to each of those things. Faith directs itself to the intellect in that it perfects it by elevating it. Hope, supernatural hope, directs itself to the will in that it perfects and elevates that. Now, how does it perfect and elevate the will? Well, what it does is it gives it the grace within this virtue, okay, enables the will to do what this virtue says. It enables the will to trust in God and therefore to dare out to reach out to Him. Because, you're faced with trials, you're faced with difficulties, you're faced with tribulations, persecutions. They're difficult, sometimes just in our human intellect. We can't see the reason for them. This virtue of hope enables us, even if we can't understand, the particular reason why God is putting us through this, this virtue enables us to know that there is a reason. And since God is a good God, there is a good reason. And since God ultimately wants us with Him in heaven for all eternity, these trials and tribulations and difficulties and persecutions, if we can go through them well, will enable us to do just that, to be with Him in heaven. So it elevates the will by enabling us to trust in God, to say, something, even though I don't understand why you're putting me through this, I trust in you. I trust it's for a good reason. I trust that if I can use it correctly, it will help in my eternal salvation. It'll help in my redemption. So that's that's how this hope works. It works on the will, so I can choose to trust God even though I may not see ultimately what He's doing. Now, we said last episode with faith that there's virtues and there's vices. And we said that there were ways you could sin against faith. And we identified 4 of them, if you recall. Well, same thing with supernatural hope. There are ways you can sin against supernatural hope, 2 ways in particular. One is the sin of despair. The other is the sin of presumption. Both of those sins, kind of on opposite ends of the spectrum, despair and presumption, both of those are sins, and ultimately they're sins against the virtue of hope. Now, what is despair? What is presumption? How do they sin against this virtue? That's the next thing we'll talk about. Let's take a look at despair first, okay? When we're talking about despair in a theological sense, how would we define it? We can define it a number of different ways. Number 1, despair, if I despair spiritually, theologically, okay, I'm losing hope of obtaining heaven. That's one way I can despair, okay? Now, why would I ever get into a situation where I'm losing hope of obtaining heaven? Well, a couple of possibilities. Number 1, I might think of myself as just beyond God's mercy. That, yes, God is merciful, but I'm beyond His reach. I'm so bad, I've lived such a bad life, I'm such a big sinner that I've put myself beyond God's mercy, and because I think that way, I despair of ever going to heaven. Okay? Another reason I could do that is because Maybe I think that my sins are too big for God to forgive. Yes, God forgives sins, but my sins are so big, okay, that God can't or won't forgive them. Therefore, I lose hope. I despair of obtaining heaven. Okay, so both of those, me being beyond God's mercy or my sins being too big for God to forgive, if I fall into those two ways of thinking, then ultimately the result of that very possibly be I might lose hope of ever getting to heaven. And that's called despair. Now, the big problem with that is if I fall into despair, if I have lost that hope of ever getting to heaven, then what might I do? I might say, well, then, it's a fait accompli. I'm not going to be able to get to heaven, so then what does it matter? This whole business of pursuing holiness, leading a moral life, leading a virtuous life, why bother? Because I'm not going to get into heaven anyway, because I'm just too big of a sinner and I'm beyond God's mercy and ability to forgive my sins. So, since, I'm kind of done for, what I might do is I might stop pursuing holiness and the moral life and the virtuous life, figuring, there's no way I'm going to make it anyway, so why bother? Okay? And obviously that's a huge problem. The other problem is not only could I stop pursuing holiness and stop pursuing a moral and virtuous life, I can compound that and then say, well, since there's no hope of me getting into heaven, then I might as well just sin away, because I'm not going to get to heaven anyway. So if I continue to sin, and if I sin bigger and bigger, it's not going to make any difference, because I'm not going to get there anyway in the first place. So this loss of the hope of getting to heaven, which we call despair, that is a huge sin, because it has huge consequences. So you can see how this sin of despair directly sins against hope. Because what is despair? It's losing what? The hope of ever getting to heaven. So if I've lost the hope of ever getting to heaven, I'm sinning against the theological virtue of hope. Because if I lose hope of getting to heaven, I've given up on God. I've given up on His grace. I've given up on His promises. I've given up on His mercy, His ability to forgive my sins, all of which hope enables me to avoid. So you can see very clearly, hopefully, how this is a sin and how it's a sin specifically against this virtue. So you might say, okay, well, I'm not in that category. I haven't lost hope of going to heaven. Well, now maybe you've swung the other way and you're committing the sin of presumption. Because although despair is the loss of hope of getting to heaven, presumption, as you might guess, is presuming that I'm going to get there and my ticket's already been punched. I'm as good as in. God is good and loving and merciful and forgiving, and at the end of the day, He's going to swing wide the gates of heaven, and everybody will be able to get in. Okay, so okay, maybe I'm not living, the best moral life I can, the most virtuous life I can. Maybe I'm not pursuing holiness to the degree that I should. But at the end of the day, I'm going to get in anyway. My ticket's already been punched. Well, you can see the problem with that. Because if I think, look, if I presume I'm as good as in, then, why really putting the effort into pursuing holiness? Why putting any effort into leading a moral life, a virtuous life? Yeah, that'd be great. And when it's convenient and easy and suits me, certainly I'll do it. But in terms of, making it a priority, Well, if I don't quite get there, that's no problem because I'm as good as in anyway. So you can see where these two sins are on opposite ends of the extreme. Despair, I lose hope in God and His graces and His promises. In presumption, I presume upon them. I presume upon God and His graces and His mercy and His love and His forgiveness and His promises. And we don't want to do either, because in any situation, you never want to operate on the extremes. The virtues, as we'll come to understand, kind of operate as a golden mean, okay, where they try and keep us away from the extremes. So, supernatural hope, just to kind of summarize before we move on to that third theological virtue, which is love. Supernatural hope, it's the desire and the confident expectation in God's kingdom being our ultimate happiness, and our trust in God and His promises and His graces, all right? And what that enables us to do is to persevere, bear up under trials, tribulations, and difficulties, and not just white knuckle and grit our teeth through them, but do it with joy. Because we've got that confident expectation in God and His promises. And that whatever trials and tribulations and difficulties come our way, we serve a good God, they're for a good purpose, and we trust in that, and we bear up underneath them well, because we know what God has promised. And then, of course, the two sins we can sin against it is we can lose all that hope and fall into despair, never thinking we'll get into heaven because we're too big of a sinner and beyond God's mercy, or we presume upon God's mercy and think that we're going to get in no matter what we do, our ticket's already been punched. So that's the supernatural virtue of hope. Now we move on to the third supernatural virtue, love, and we'll begin it the same way. Distinguish natural love from supernatural love. Now, natural love is a feeling and emotion, okay? It's something that happens to us. In a way, you can kind of think of it as us being passive recipients of an emotional experience. That's why you hear the phrase, falling in love. So again, natural love, it's an emotion, it's a feeling, it's something that happens to us, and we're passive recipients of this emotional experience. That's natural love. Supernatural love, rather than being a feeling or an emotion, supernatural love is an act of the will. And because it's an act of the will, it's not passive, it's not something that happens to us, it's active, it's something we do. And this act of the will that love is, okay, what are we willing? We're willing the good of the other person. So that, in a nutshell, is what supernatural love is. It's an act of the will in which we will the good of the other person. And when we mean the good of the other person, we're talking physically and spiritually. We want the best possible outcome physically and spiritually for that other person. That's supernatural love. Can it contain emotions and feelings? Yes. But what makes love love is not the emotion and the feeling, it's the act of the will. That's what makes love love. It's something we choose to do. Because again, when we say it's an act of the will, we're talking free will. And our free will enables us to make choices. So true love is something I choose to do. Okay? I can't, you can't force me to love you. You can't threaten me or blackmail me, okay? True love, to be true love, must be freely given. It's got to be an act of the will, all right? And again, we're willing the ultimate good physically, but even more than that, spiritually. Now, it's been said that to the degree that we sacrifice for the other, that's the degree that we love the other. Let me say that again. It's been said that to the degree that we're willing to sacrifice for the other, that's the degree that we love the other. Because again, sacrificing for the other is a choice. It's an act of the will. Now, who is the other? Well, ultimately, we love God first and foremost, right, with our whole heart, mind, soul, and strength. So ultimately, our love is directed first and foremost to God. Secondly, it's directed to ourselves. Our physical, we have to love ourselves, our physical selves and our spiritual selves. And then thirdly, it's directed to our neighbor. We have to love his physical self and his spiritual self. So love of God, love of ourselves, and love of our nature. And when we're talking about our love of God, love of ourselves, and love of our neighbor, I should say, and when we're talking about love of ourselves and love of our neighbor, we're talking two aspects, physical and spiritual. Now, let me hit the pause button, because I'm sure you know the passage, Matthew 22, verses 36 to 40. You know, the young man runs up to Jesus and he asks him a question. He says, "Teacher, what is the greatest commandment?" And how does Jesus reply? He says, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind." That's the first, okay? And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. So in Jesus' reply, he points out those three. Love God, and then he talks about loving neighbor and loving self. So the three recipients, if you will, of this supernatural virtue of love, God, ourselves, neighbor, all of them are indicated in Jesus' reply. And Jesus indicates, love your neighbor as yourself. And the question's always been, well, okay, love my neighbor as myself. Well, how do I love myself? All right? We've just indicated that. You know, love of self is both physical and spiritual. Love of neighbor is physical and spiritual. Okay? So we want the best possible outcomes for ourselves, health-wise, physically, and spiritually. And we want the same for our neighbor. And of course, and you know this, who is our neighbor? Jesus also indicates that, right? In the parable of the Good Samaritan. Our neighbors are our friends and our enemies. Love your enemies, right? Friends, enemies, people we like, people we dislike. So this supernatural virtue of love, directed first to God, then to ourselves, then to our neighbor, is very expansive. Because when it gets to that third aspect, neighbor, you're talking friends, enemies, people you like, people you dislike. That pretty much encompasses everybody. So if you think about it, we are commanded to will the physical and spiritual good of everybody. Now that's difficult to do, especially the enemy's part, especially the people you don't like part. But nevertheless, we're called to do that. And that takes grace, right? And where do we get the grace to do just that? From this particular virtue, the supernatural virtue of love. Because humanly speaking, it's impossible for us to do this. The only thing that allows us to do this is the grace that this virtue contains. And that goes back to something that we mentioned in the first episode when we were looking at the virtues in general, is, faith, hope. God never asks us to do anything that he doesn't give us the grace to be able to do. Now, again, we have to cooperate with that grace. But God doesn't lay a bunch of stuff on us and say, good luck with that. You know, I'm going to go back into heaven and see if you can pull this off. Whatever God asks us to do, he gives us the grace to do it. All right? The sacraments, the gifts of the Holy Spirit, prayer, and the virtues. All right? So to have faith in God and what he says because he's God, he's given us the grace to do that through the supernatural virtue of faith. To give us the grace to be able to bear up under trials, tribulations, and difficulties and to do it with joy. He gives us the grace to do that in the theological virtue of hope. To will the physical and spiritual good of everybody. He gives us the ability to do that. He gives us the grace to do that through the theological virtue of love. So that's why these virtues are so important, is because they give us the grace to do these things. But then again, like we always say, we've got to cooperate with this grace. So that's natural love versus supernatural love. That's what supernatural love calls us to do, and that's who it calls us to do it to. God, ourselves, and neighbor being everybody. Now, what does all this consist of? Well, let's go back and let's refer to St. Paul. Because St. Paul, in his first letter to the Corinthians, lists out 14 different things that supernatural love should contain. It's in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verses 4 to 7. All right? Now, if you say to yourself, okay, Charles, you know, how do I know that I am loving people in this way? All right? How do I know if I am exhibiting supernatural love, the theological virtue of love? Well, in this passage in 1 Corinthians, Paul, in a sense, gives us kind of a little checklist that we can self-check. Here are the attributes, if you will, to kind of check yourself to see if you are loving people in this sort of way. He says, love is, and he's talking about supernatural love, not natural love, obviously. Love is, and you probably know, patient, kind, it doesn't envy, it's not pretentious, it's not proud, it's not ambitious in a self-serving, seeking way, it's not selfish, it's not provoked to anger, it rejoices in truth, it bears all things, it believes all things that God has revealed, it hopes all things, it endures all things, and it does not rejoice over wickedness. So if you say to yourselves, am I exhibiting this kind of love that this virtue calls for? Well, there's my checklist. Am I patient? Am I kind? Am I not selfish? Am I not proud? Am I not envious? Do I rejoice in the truth? Etc., etc., etc. Okay? Because these things are part and parcel of love, which is the virtue that we're speaking about right here and now. Now, again, just like with the other two virtues, how does this virtue do what it enables us to do if we cooperate with the grace that it contains? Well, once again, it's a question of perfect. Now, faith perfects the intellect by elevating it, right? Hope perfects the will by elevating it. Love perfects the will, right? And it elevates it to be able to love God for his own sake, not what he might or might not do for us, to love ourselves as images and likenesses of God, and to love our neighbor as images and likeness of God. Because we said, our love is directed God, ourselves, and neighbor, right? and we talked about the form of that love, willing the good, the ultimate good, physical and spiritual, all right? Well, this grace enables us to do that because it enables us, yes, to love God, but to love Him for who He is, not for what He may or may not do for us. Yes, it enables us to love ourselves and to love our neighbor, right? For their own sake, for their own well-being. And ultimately, to love God above all things. It elevates our will to choose to do that. Now, one other thing we should say about this supernatural virtue of love, all right? And again, let's go back to St. Paul and his first letter of the Corinthians, because there's two passages in this first letter to the Corinthians where Paul indicates that of the three theological virtues, faith, hope, and love, the most excellent of the three is love. And you probably know the verses, all right? 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 13. Faith, hope, charity, love abide. These three. But the greatest of these is love. He says it again, same chapter, 1 Corinthians chapter 13, but now let's go back to the first couple of verses of that chapter. If I have not charity, love, if I have not love, I am nothing. Whatever my privilege, whatever my service, or even virtue, if I have not charity or love, I have nothing. So Paul indicates that of the three theological virtues, this one here, love, is the most excellent of them. Okay? So, with that said, now how can we sin against love? We can sin against love, and you might say, well, obviously, if you murder somebody or you injure somebody or something like that, well, right. But if we go back to that checklist that Paul gives us of those 14 things that this virtue of love should contain, should consist of, that we should exhibit if we're doing it, then we can also say that we can sin against this virtue by not doing that, all right? By willfully not doing that. So let's just pick out a couple of examples. Supernatural love is patient, all right? If I am willingly impatient, I'm kind of sinning against this virtue. Supernatural love is not envious. If I'm willingly envious, I'm sinning against this virtue, okay? If supernatural love does not rejoice over wickedness. If I'm rejoicing over wickedness, I'm sinning against these virtues. So, yeah, these are sins, but now we know they're sins specifically against this virtue, the supernatural virtue of love. So with that, we'll wrap up this episode and conclude our consideration of the three theological virtues. Faith, last episode, hope, and love, this episode. And again, these three theological virtues, they're called theological because they're infused in us directly by God. We get them at our baptism. They're strengthened and confirmed in our confirmation. So with that, we'll conclude this particular episode. The next two episodes, episode 4 and episode 5, we'll consider the four more